So I was searching for more Bocchi the Rock content to preserve my sanity when I discovered a very obscure fan game of the series, which basically explores the narrative of what if you take your pill. I mean, what if Nijika, the one who started it all, is suddenly taken out from the story? Well, that's exactly what this game's about. It adds a very cruel and dark twist of the innocent and wholesome series Bocchi the Rock, which revolves around Nijika and Ryo. So better prepare your tissues, cause this is gonna get incredibly heavy. If you'd played games like Undertale, Amori, Ione, and the like, then I'm sure you'd like Heaven for Death as well, made by this guy, which has the same format, minus the combat mechanics. It's an RPG Maker game where the creator took the joke of Nijika as an angel way too literally, with the setting taking place in heaven. Now, what comes to your mind when you hear heaven? The first thing that comes into your mind is that it's a place filled with clouds and other heavenly features, right? Well, here heaven is filled with buildings and other recreational facilities like shops, casinos, and a love hotel of all things for the purpose of entertainment, which is held together by a mast suspended in the air. And obviously, in the game's universe, this is where dead people who are worthy go while retaining their memories, and once they do, they have a choice to reincarnate or to stay in heaven. If you are unfamiliar with reincarnation, then it's basically living another life after dying without the memories of your past life. And so the whole premise of the game circulates around this. Now, the game's narrative structure is very non-linear, which I believe really enhances the impact of the game's storytelling by giving us hints of flashbacks that makes us think that something went horribly wrong. But it can get very confusing at times, so bear with me as I try to fit the pieces of the puzzle together. As we start the game, the very first thing you see is Bocchi saying, "With this, everything will end," as she mentions how she'll never achieve Kesukoban's dream and a name which was censored by the game, while with seemingly Ryo beside her. From this opening alone, you'd really feel an ominous vibe and raise a lot of questions. Like, who was Bocchi trying to mention? Why was Ryo with her? Why was Bocchi talking as if she's saying goodbye to the world? But before we can think about the answers to these questions, Ryo wakes up in the gates of heaven. Shocking, I know. And in the distance, we can see a familiar figure that we all know and adore. It was none other than Nijika. But upon exploring and interacting with her, you can notice a few weird things. Ryo was talking to Nijika as if she doesn't know her. And the game at first then names Ryo as an unnamed dead person, which raises even more questions. But as you further interact with her, it's slowly revealed that Ryo lost her memories completely, not even remembering her own name. So Nijika introduced herself as Shimokitazawa, which is the area she is in charge of with her angel duties, and gives Ryo the name of, well, Ryo, not knowing that was her actual real name. And a little bit of a fun fact, Shimokitazawa is the same place where the events of Bocchi the Rock took place. The mystery deepens as Nijika decides to refer to herself as Shimokitazawa instead of her real name. Like, why couldn't she just tell her real name and make Ryo remember everything? Ryo is Nijika's friend after all. But it didn't seem to matter to Nijika at the moment, as she shows Ryo around heaven, which was filled with cats, dogs, other animals, and Tom the talking cat, as they have a little fun, just like how the two interact usually in the anime or manga. Very wholesome, but it took a dark turn, a sudden 90-degree sharp corner turn. As they were having fun, the inside of the building suddenly rains, indicating that there's some sort of disturbance. And from the looks of Nijika's face, this was quite the serious matter, as she left Ryo to meet someone who she refers to as that person. As Nijika steps into the room to meet that person, we can see how dark and ominous the room is, as flames erupted out of nowhere to prevent her from going back until she talks to this person. When you then interact with the clock in this room, it'll begin a dialogue, and from their conversation, you can get the idea that this clock is the higher authority in heaven. God, perhaps. God then revealed that they are in rage due to the fact that Nijika brought a sinner to heaven, that being Ryo. A sinner? Ryo? That question echoed through my mind. What did she do exactly? And that was quickly answered by God unveiling a terrible revelation that Ryo had caused a blameless person to die. And that person is none other than Hitori Goto, the same pink-haired girl that we're all familiar with, and the same one that we saw at the opening of the game. But that's impossible, right? Ryo would never kill someone, especially if that someone is Bocchi, one of her bandmates. And the fact that we didn't see Bocchi in heaven despite God telling us that she died can mean only one thing. Bocchi, after her death, was sent to hell. So Nijika objected to this accusation, saying that she'll do anything to prove the innocence of Ryo, may it be the cost of eternal damnation to hell or complete erasure of their souls if they're ever wrong. God then listened to Nijika's offer and laid off for now, saying that they'll contact Nijika and maybe even Ryo soon. Until then, Ryo and Nijika went to a beach, which she referred to as the actual heaven. There, Nijika told Ryo about an old friend she used to have, and unbeknownst to Ryo, Nijika just described her when she was still alive. Nijika also mentioned about an incident that separated Ryo from her, which is still a mystery to us. But as soon as this cutscene ended, another cutscene plays with Bocchi and Ryo, where she mentioned that she lost passion in music and her hobbies, even saying that Bocchi is like her, a shell of their former self, as Bocchi even deletes her Guitar Hero account. From this statement alone, you can feel the impact of how much of a downward spiral they experienced ever since that day. But that's not all. Bocchi says something very strange. Ryo, do you really not remember? To which Ryo responds with an even stranger statement. Are you talking about your imaginary friend again? Going back to the original manga and anime, there were no instances of Bocchi ever having an imaginary friend whatsoever. The only thing that qualifies as Bocchi's imaginary friend was this weird sentient guitar, so maybe it's that? But Bocchi wouldn't ask Ryo if she remembers this person. It wasn't someone who Ryo once knew, but for some reason does not remember, so it can't be that weird guitar thing. But the cutscene falls short as we were taken back to heaven, where God finally gave orders to Ryo to convince 100 people to reincarnate into their next life. Since people are refusing to do so, doing so would be enough to pardon her of her sins, probably. But this gets even darker the deeper we go into the game, as many things start to happen, like Ryo's sinful tactics of convincing people to reincarnate. The incident that kept on being mentioned actually revolves around Nijika, while the true identity of Bocchi's imaginary friend was actually someone we know well. Ryo's memories partly coming back with no recollection of Nijika. Nijika's biggest mistake, and an extremely ominous statement coming from her, as she called herself someone who didn't exist. So, going back, after receiving the orders from God, Ryo started her task to convince 100 people to reincarnate. So she began with a little girl who was trying to find her parents, not knowing they're still on Earth. Ryo, being Ryo, tried to persuade the child into reincarnation the best way she can, by lying and making up stories. Ryo told the child that she already saw both her parents in heaven and claimed that her parents were looking for her, and when they couldn't find their daughter, they decided to reincarnate. The little child, hearing this, decides to reincarnate immediately, not knowing Ryo fabricated a complete lie. Ryo is a very bold one, committing such a sin right at the grounds of heaven. Nijika got a little upset with Ryo's methods, but didn't do anything about it, since she told herself that this is just Ryo being her usual self, in a bad way. So after convincing that child to reincarnate as both Nijika and Ryo wandered heaven for a little while, the day ends. And then we were suddenly thrown another cutscene. Nijika, who seemingly does not have angel wings this time, was on the street as she saw a kitten right on the middle of the road. Try to guess what happens next. Whatever dark thoughts you have right now about what could possibly had happened is most likely correct. Nijika got run over by a car trying to protect the kitten. This was how Nijika died. But this is just the surface about what actually happened, because in the very next scene, we can see that Nijika is all bloodied as God talks to her. God made Nijika remember of her true nature, that she was once an angel in charge of the Shimokitazawa area before this, and told her that her entire 19 years living as a human was nothing but a test. A test that if she failed, she would have continued living as a human. So we can safely assume that Nijika lived her life the same as the original Bocchi the Rock series, up until when Nijika turns 19. Of course, when Nijika hears this, she questioned God. If her whole life as a human was just a test, then is her 19 years of life as a human meaningless? What about her dreams, her friends, the bonds, connections she made, and everyone who she left behind? And as if a twisted joke, God erased everyone's memories of Nijika's life as a human on Earth as a countermeasure so that she may not have attachments on Earth. But that greatly upset Nijika. As if her life being a test wasn't bad enough, memories about her have vanished, practically erasing her existence to others. The funny part is that God admitted that they had not considered this. So in exchange for this, God granted Nijika the power to change one of her friend's fate, to have a better life. Still not a good compensation in my opinion, but Nijika will just have to take it. And so, the person that Nijika chose was not revealed right away, as the flashback ends with Nijika waking up to Ryo, convincing several people to reincarnate, with Ryo becoming some sort of messiah or fortune teller about people's future reincarnations. After all that work, Ryo became tired, even though she wasn't, and asked Nijika to take a walk outside. But when they did, they met someone, a deceased person who was a fan of Kesiko band and recognized Ryo and fangirled over her. She had no idea what she was talking about because she still doesn't have her memories back. But as soon as the fan stopped spawning of Ryo, the fan asked a dark question. Didn't you kill yourself? Why are you in heaven? A moment of realization, as some of the pieces of the puzzle suddenly started fitting into place, as a little bit of light is shed into Ryo's death. She had ended herself. Nijika, in a state of panic, called for the help of another angel to erase the fans' memories and turn back time to avoid conflict. As they do, part of Ryo's memories return. She remembered that she was the bassist of Kesiko band, how she died, and that it was no coincidence that Nijika gave her the name of Ryo. And Ryo somehow knew that Nijika, or Shimokitazawa in this case, was a part of her life. When Nijika hears this, she let out her bottled emotions and guilt. She says that Nijika changed Ryo's life with the intention of making it better, but instead Ryo died early at the age of 23 and assumed that it was her fault. With this statement, we can safely assume that the person that Nijika chose to change someone's fate was indeed Ryo. But that didn't work out, didn't it? This also answers the question of what Ryo did to Bocchi that caused her to die. She encouraged her to do it together. But instead of dwelling on the past, Ryo calmed Nijika down and told her to stop thinking about it, or that she can help her search for answers. Nijika thought about it for a while, but then decided to search for answers. That being descending back to Earth as a human and figuring out what happened to Kesiko band. With the help of another angel, she went back to Earth before God notices that Nijika suspiciously disappeared from heaven. And by stroke of a miracle, Nijika coincidentally awakens in a train where Seika is, her big sister. Seika doesn't remember Nijika, but Nijika surely remembers Seika. She wanted to ask her so many questions, but she knew it would be useless to do so as she doesn't remember her. And by another stroke of luck, it turns out that Kita was actually on the train, as she mentions Bocchi, meaning that Bocchi, despite what God told us, is actually alive and never went to hell. So then why did God lie? Why did they say that Ryo caused Bocchi to die? Nijika tried to ask Kita questions, but before she could, she was called back to heaven by the angel that helped her to avoid suspicion, and so Nijika returned. with Nijika happily confirming that Kita, Seika, and especially Bocchi are alive, and with Ryo convincing a lot of people to reincarnate that day, took Ryo to a cool place in heaven where most of the recreational facilities are, to eat and window shop. And so after that, they bought alcohol to drink at Nijika's dorm together. This part is where Nijika started talking about herself and answered some remaining questions about her as an angel. She told Ryo that she was originally an angel, punished by God due to her changing the fate of a child who was killed by her parents at a very young age. She felt bad, so she changed the fate of that child, so that child may live a happy life when they reincarnated. But she did this without God's permission. God, enraged, stripped her of being an angel and sent her down to earth as a human without her memories as an angel. This was the real reason why Nijika lived as a human. It was a punishment and a test at the same time. Ryo saw how much Nijika was hurting, so she hugged her and suggested that from that point onwards, they would put their past behind them and forget about everything that happened to focus on a task that God gave to her. And so they did. And within the time frame of 1 month, Ryo was able to convince 99 out of 100 people to reincarnate. Nijika knew that as soon as Ryo convinces the last person to reincarnate, she would not hesitate to reincarnate, which would result with her memories and her time with heaven being erased. So they spent the little time they had left at the beach to reminisce and say their goodbyes. The cutscene ended, and then another one was shown. And this time, it was a flashback of Bocchi and Ryo together, which I presume is when they're about to do it. But this flashback gave us an important piece of detail through the dialogue. Ryo asked about Bocchi's closet, saying that she was the only one that had not heard of what's inside the closet. Bocchi then replied that it was okay, since no one but her remembers her anyways. But as she speaks further, she mentions Nijika, how they won't see her because they'll go to hell due to what they're doing. Noticed something weird with what I said? Well, it wasn't your imagination. Bocchi somehow remembers Nijika despite God's memory erasure. But how? How was she able to remember? Well, the answer is actually in her dialogue as well, if we carefully analyze it. Ryo mentions Bocchi's closet, but Bocchi replies that it doesn't matter if she knows what's inside anyways, which means that there's something inside that closet that made Bocchi remember about Nijika. But what it could possibly be? You probably know the answer to this already, and as ridiculous as it is, you're correct. The thing that was inside of Bocchi's closet is the uncountable amounts of the photo that the four of them first took to promote their band. Who knew that Bocchi's insane obsession with this photo would be the reason that would overpower God's memories erasure and remember Nijika? But with all that, the flashback ends as Ryo stood before God. God called out her deceptive methods of convincing people to reincarnate, but could not deny her hard work. So God decided to reward Ryo by forgiving her sins, allowing her to reincarnate, returned her memory in full, with the added privilege of allowing her to remember her life as Ryo and her time in heaven in her next life. And with that, her reward was granted, and she had only one thing left to do, to convince one last person to reincarnate. Do that, and her task is complete. At this point, the player can choose to explore parts of heaven before attending to the final soul. Once you think you've explored enough, then it would be time to meet the final soul, so that Ryo's task would finally be complete. Both Nijika and Ryo went to the gates of heaven to meet the final soul, but as soon as they got there, they were shocked. The person that lies before them was a person they both know too well. It was none other than Bocchi herself. And although she is not seen clearly, we can tell that Bocchi is old at this point, since we can barely see the cane she's holding. Nijika also confirmed that Bocchi died of old age, and think to herself that maybe the reason that Bocchi lived a long life despite her fated death was because God took pity on Bocchi and changed her fate. So maybe that's why God lied in the first place. Then Bocchi, despite forgetting Nijika's name, still remember everything she did with her. Sort of. and was glad to confirm that Nijika truly existed and was not a hallucination or an imaginary friend of Bocchi. She then revealed what actually happened the day they tried to attempt to end everything. In the very nick of time, she was saved by someone, which I'll assume was Kita, since when Bocchi woke up in hospital, it was Kita who was beside her. And they moved out to Shimokitazawa since they had too many bad memories there. Bocchi also said that until she passed away, Kita was with her the whole time, still full of energy as usual. She did not decide to stay in heaven though. Bocchi, being Bocchi, still had social anxiety and told Nijika she can't stay due to the sheer amounts of strangers in heaven, which made Nijika a little emotional since even after all those years, Bocchi did not really change. And so Ryo and Nijika began Bocchi's reincarnation. But before that, Nijika asked if Bocchi had a wish in her next life. All Bocchi said is that she wanted to play with the four of them again: Kita, Nijika, Ryo, and herself as a band, since that was the most fun Bocchi had in her life. And so Bocchi reincarnates. And with that, Ryo's task was complete. She had convinced 100 people to reincarnate. It was her time to leave and reincarnate as well. Nijika begged Ryo to stay, even though she knows full well that that's not the type of person Ryo is. So instead of insisting her to stay, Nijika promised Ryo that they'll see each other again. And so Ryo promised her that as well. As Ryo calls out to her one last time and says, "We'll meet again someday." Nijika. With that, Ryo finally reincarnates, retaining all of her memories. But let's go back to Ryo's final words before saying goodbye. Did you notice that Ryo called Nijika by her real name instead of Shimokitazawa? This can only mean one thing. Not only did God return memories of her past life, but they also returned the erased memories of Nijika. Nijika won't have to worry about Ryo forgetting her anymore. Her best friend is back, and it's only a matter of waiting. And so with that, the game's story ends, and we have a bittersweet ending. You know, I'm very thankful that this is just a fan game and not actually canon, because if somehow Aki Hamazi does something like this when Nijika turns 19 in the manga, I'm gonna lose it. But nevertheless, I really enjoyed this game despite having confusing writing, especially with how God was written here, which I feel like was written to be antagonistic for the sake of the plot, but still enjoyable. And as sadistic as this sounds, I also love the narrative here that Bocchi was made to believe that Nijika was not real, which I feel like is a reference to the fandom's schizo posting about Nijika not being real and telling those schizo posters to take their pills. But with that said, I encourage you to play this game for yourselves. There are actually 2 more endings within the game by making important choices. This game also has plentiful amounts of fan service between Nijika and Ryo and the series in general, so do check that out. And one last important thing. At the very end of the game, there contains a chest, which has some of the unanswered questions you may had about the lore of the game. So if you want to find that out, then I suggest you do play the game and explore as much as you can. Or if you really don't have the time to play this game, then I guess I'll put the chess content deep into the description of the video. But hey, if you enjoyed this video about Bocchi the Rock, then I have 2 more for you to watch right here. But that's it for this one, and I'll see you there.